When the widow down the street asked me for one small favor, I thought it would end there. But that single moment of kindness pulled me into her quiet world, and into a connection I never saw coming. I didn't know her well at the time. To me, she was just the widow at the end of the street, a quiet presence in the neighborhood, graceful in a way that drew notice without her ever asking for it. Her house always looked carefully kept, though I couldn't help but sense it carried a certain stillness, as if too many days had passed without laughter echoing inside its walls. That afternoon, I saw her struggling with something as simple as groceries. A heavy bag had torn just at the top of her walkway, spilling cans and apples across the pavement. I didn't even think, my legs just carried me over. "Here, let me get that," I said, crouching quickly before she could protest. She gave me a look at first, the kind people wear when they aren't sure whether to accept help. But then her shoulders softened, and she let out the faintest sigh of relief. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice warm yet edged with exhaustion, as though the weight of asking, even silently, was heavier than the groceries themselves. I gathered the cans and tucked them back neatly into the bag, carrying it up to her porch before she could insist on doing it herself. She followed beside me, and for the first time I noticed the delicate lines at the corners of her eyes. They weren't harsh, but gentle, like proof of a life fully lived. Her presence had a quiet dignity to it. When I handed the bag back to her, our fingers brushed. Just for a moment, an accident, really. But her skin was warm against mine, and it startled me how much that small contact lingered even after she'd drawn her hand away. "You've saved me from a very undignified mess," she said with a faint smile. I laughed softly. "I don't think spilled apples are enough to ruin anyone's dignity." She tilted her head, studying me in a way that made me aware of myself, how I stood, how I spoke. There was no judgment in her gaze, but rather a careful curiosity, as though she was measuring how much space she could allow me to take in her world. As we reached her door, she hesitated, holding it half open as though deciding whether to end the moment or not. "Would you mind helping me with one more thing? Just a small favor," she asked finally, her tone almost apologetic. I agreed before I even knew what it was. Maybe it was the softness in her voice, or the way her eyes carried both confidence and quiet vulnerability at once. Whatever it was, I couldn't turn away. And though I didn't know it then, that single yes, offered so casually, was the first step into something that would change the shape of both our lives. After the groceries incident, I didn't expect to see her again so soon. But the very next week, I noticed her standing by her garden fence, hesitating as if debating whether or not to wave me over. When our eyes met, she smiled, shy, almost apologetic, and asked if I had a moment. "It's nothing urgent," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But the hinges on the gate are stubborn, and I can't quite manage them myself." I followed her into the garden. The space was beautiful, carefully tended, but there was something in the way she moved, purposeful, graceful, that made it clear she had done most of the work alone. Fixing the gate didn't take long. I tightened the hinges, tested them twice, and before I knew it, the task was done. When I turned to leave, she surprised me. "Would you stay for tea? Just a few minutes. It's the least I can offer." I agreed, curious more than anything, and stepped into her home for the first time. It was neat, warmly lit, filled with little traces of her life, photographs in silver frames, half-read books stacked on a side table, a vase of fresh flowers by the window. But there was also a quietness to it, a stillness that seemed to press in from the walls. We sat across from each other at a small kitchen table, steam curling from 2 cups of tea. At first, the conversation was polite, neighbors, the weather, simple things. But something about the way she listened made me linger on my words, and something about the way she spoke made me want to ask more. I noticed the pauses between her sentences, the way she glanced at the photographs and then quickly look away. There was a guardedness there, but also a softness, as if she was torn between protecting herself and wanting to be seen. When I finally stood to go, she followed me to the door. "If you wouldn't mind," she said quietly, "there's another small thing I could use help with." "Not now, another time, when you're free." Her tone carried both hesitation and hope, and before I could stop myself, I nodded. Of course. Just let me know. She smiled then, genuine, touched with relief, and it struck me how rare that smile must be. Not the polite one she gave neighbors on the street, but something warmer, almost younger, as if I'd pulled it from a place she hadn't visited in a while. I left her house that day with more than the satisfaction of tightening a gate. I left with the sense that I had been trusted with something fragile, something unspoken. And though I couldn't explain why, I already knew I'd come back. What I didn't realize was that her one more favor would soon become many. And each one would draw me closer to the quiet life she had hidden behind those walls. By the third or fourth time I found myself at her house, the word favor had started to feel less like a request and more like a gentle ritual between us. She never asked for much, just small things she couldn't quite manage on her own, but each time I stayed a little longer than necessary. Each time, it became less about the task and more about the quiet company that followed it. That afternoon, she wanted help with a shelf in her living room. The wood had begun to sag under the weight of too many books, and she admitted she had been putting it off for weeks. We worked together side by side, my hands busy with screws and brackets while she handed me tools and held pieces steady. She wasn't afraid to be close enough that I caught the faint scent of lavender on her skin, close enough that her arm brushed mine now and then in ways that sent small, uninvited sparks up my chest. At one point, I climbed a short ladder to reach the top of the shelf. Without asking, she stepped forward and held the ladder in place. "Just in case," she said, her voice calm but her grip firm, protective. When I glanced down, her eyes lifted to meet mine. For a heartbeat, either of us looked away. It wasn't the kind of look people give in passing. It was longer, steadier, filled with a quiet acknowledgement neither of us dared to put into words. I felt my chest tighten, my hands suddenly more aware of their movements. Once the shelf was secured, she reached out instinctively to dust my palms with the cloth she'd been holding. "You've made quite the mess of yourself," she teased softly. Her fingers grazed mine as she wiped away the fine layer of dust. The touch lingered a fraction longer than necessary, her thumb brushing lightly against my knuckle before she pulled back. I don't think she meant for it to feel so intimate. But the warmth of that brief contact stayed with me long after she turned away to straighten the books. I busied myself packing up the tools, though my thoughts were far from focused. The silence between us was different now, not empty, not awkward, but weighted with something unspoken. Every movement felt heightened. The way she smoothed her skirt before sitting down, the way I caught myself watching her tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. When it was time to leave, she thanked me again with that small, graceful smile of hers. But her hand lingered on the doorframe as if she, too, wasn't entirely ready to let the moment end. I walked home that evening carrying more than just the satisfaction of a shelf repaired. I carried the memory of her eyes meeting mine, of her hand brushing against mine, and of how suddenly, quietly, the distance between us didn't feel quite as wide as it once had. It was the rain that kept me there longer than usual. I'd finished tightening the last bolt on a squeaky window frame when the storm broke open, sudden and heavy, drumming against the roof like an urgent warning. She insisted I wait it out. "No sense in getting drenched," she said, so I found myself sitting across from her in the quiet glow of her living room, both of us listening to the storm outside. The room was warm, lived in, but it carried the hush of spaces that had grown used to silence. A framed photo of her late husband sat on the mantel, his smile frozen in time. She noticed my eyes linger there and cleared her throat softly. "This house," she began, her voice low, almost swallowed by the rain. "It feels too big sometimes. Too empty." Her fingers traced the rim of her teacup, careful and slow. "I thought I'd grow used to it, but some nights it feels louder than others. The kind of quiet you can't shut out." I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I let the weight of her words settle, giving them the space they deserved. Finally, I said, "I think I understand. Not the same way, maybe, but sometimes I feel like I'm floating through my own life. Too young to have answers, too old to be reckless. Just, in between." She looked at me then, her eyes softened by something that felt almost like recognition. The rain rattled against the windows, but for a moment the world outside blurred and it was just the two of us, two people from different sides of life's map, both quietly admitting we hadn't found our way. Her hand shifted on the table, hesitant, before resting gently on mine. Not heavy, not insistent, just there. Her palm was warm, her touch steady. I froze for half a second, afraid that if I moved, the moment would break. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as if she'd stepped over a line she shouldn't have. "Don't be," I said quickly, my voice lower than I meant it to be. Neither of us moved to draw back. Her thumb brushed once against my hand, the smallest gesture, but it was enough to make my chest feel like it carried something too big to hold. The rain carried on, unbothered by our silence. Eventually, she stood to pour more tea, and I let my hand fall back to the table. The distance returned, but it was different now. Something had shifted, something unspoken but undeniable. When the storm finally eased and I left her house that night, I carried the echo of her touch with me. It wasn't just kindness, and it wasn't just comfort. It was something deeper, wrapped in hesitation, wrapped in fear. A confession, but one neither of us had the courage to name. It was almost inevitable that someone would notice. Small towns have a way of watching, of carrying whispers from one doorstep to another. One afternoon, as I left her porch with a toolbox in hand, a neighbor across the street called out with a teasing grin. "You've become her right-hand man, haven't you?" The words were harmless on the surface, but I saw how they landed. She smiled politely, waved back, but once the neighbor disappeared indoors, her expression shifted, like a curtain falling across a window. Inside, she busied herself straightening the same books she'd already arranged. "You don't have to keep coming by so often," she said, her tone light, but her hands wouldn't stay still. "I mean, you're young. You must have better things to do than fixing leaky faucets for someone twice your age." I leaned against the counter, watching her avoid my eyes. "Is that really what you think?" I asked. She hesitated, fingers pausing over the spine of a book. "I just don't want to take too much of your time. People might get the wrong idea." Her voice softened on the last sentence, as though she was speaking more to herself than to me. The truth pressed against my chest, but I didn't let it out. Instead, I answered the only way I knew how, by showing up again the next day. And the day after that. Sometimes she didn't ask for anything at all. I'd just knock, and she'd open the door with that same guarded surprise, as though she half expected me to disappear. It wasn't grand gestures that mattered. It was the small things, the way I carried the heavier groceries without being asked, or how I fixed the light bulb in her hallway before she even noticed it had gone out. And it was the way she lingered at the door when I left, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. One evening, as I stood to go, she reached out almost instinctively, her hand resting lightly on my arm. The touch was soft, hesitant, but it stopped me in my tracks. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. But there was more weight behind those two words than gratitude alone. I met her eyes, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with everything left unsaid, her fear of being seen, my fear of pushing too far, both of us caught in the fragile balance between what we wanted and what we believed we should want. When I finally stepped out into the night, the warmth of her hand on my arm stayed with me long after the cool air should have washed it away. It was hesitation, yes. But it was also proof that even in her caution, she hadn't closed the door. Not to me. Not to us. It was one of those evenings that slipped away faster than either of us noticed. I'd come by to repair a loose shutter on the side of her house, expecting to be gone before the sun went down. But the task stretched longer, as they often did, and when I finally packed my tools away, the sky was already glowing with the last traces of orange. She invited me to sit for a moment on the porch, and I didn't hesitate. The air was warm, filled with the steady hum of cicadas, the scent of damp earth rising from the garden after a light rain earlier in the day. We sat close enough that our shoulders almost brushed, though either of us made the move to widen the space. She folded her hands in her lap, and I could feel the quiet rhythm of her breathing beside me. For a while neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, charged, like something waiting to be said. Finally, her voice broke through, soft but trembling. "I never expected." She stopped, pressing her lips together as though the words were dangerous. Then she tried again. "I never expected someone like you to make this house feel alive again." I turned to her, but she kept her eyes fixed on the fading light. I could see the way her throat tightened when she swallowed, how her fingers twisted against one another in her lap. "You've brought me back to life in ways I didn't think possible," she whispered. The confession hung in the air, fragile and raw. Almost immediately, she pulled back, shaking her head as though she regretted letting it slip. "I'm sorry. That was selfish of me." Her words pierced deeper than she knew. I wanted to tell her she had nothing to apologize for, that she wasn't selfish, she was human, aching, just like me. But I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let my hand move, slow and deliberate, until it rested over hers. She froze, startled at first, and then her breath eased out in a shiver. She didn't pull away. For a long moment, we sat like that, my hand covering hers, her palm warm and trembling beneath mine, the silence between us louder than any words could have been. I wanted to speak, to tell her what she meant to me, to admit that every day I spent with her made the world outside feel less certain, less necessary. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I let the gesture speak for itself. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were shining, not with tears exactly, but with something caught between fear and hope. The porch light flickered on above us, breaking the spell. Slowly, gently, I let my fingers slip from hers. The moment had passed, but it left a mark, undeniable and deep. That night, as I walked home, I carried the truth with me. Whatever this was, it was no longer something either of us could ignore. In the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted. She no longer called what I did favors. She didn't stand in the doorway apologizing for asking too much, nor did she search for excuses to explain why she needed me there. Instead, she'd simply say, "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Or, "I was thinking of walking to the market, come with me?" The simplicity of it carried more weight than any declaration could have. It wasn't about tasks anymore. It was about time, choosing to spend it together, without needing a reason. Neighbors still watched. I caught their glances when we walked side by side down the street, her carrying a small basket, me keeping step with her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Maybe they whispered, maybe they didn't. If they did, I realized I no longer cared. And more importantly, I don't think she did either. One evening, I arrived with no tools, no errands, no excuse. Just myself. She opened the door, surprised at first, then smiled in a way that told me she understood without needing to ask. We shared dinner at her table, laughter coming easier now, her voice lighter than when I'd first heard it weeks ago. When the plates were cleared and the evening drew quiet, I found myself lingering in the living room, unwilling to leave. She joined me on the couch, sitting close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence. For a long while, we didn't speak. The house, once so still, seemed to breathe with us. Finally, she turned to me, her expression soft but steady. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" "Spending your time here. With me." Her words were simple, but I heard the years of doubt beneath them, the fear that she was too much or not enough. I shook my head. "Not once." Her eyes searched mine, as if waiting for the hesitation that never came. And then, almost carefully, she leaned toward me. Her arms slipped around my waist, her cheek resting lightly against my chest. The contact was delicate, but it carried a depth no words could reach. I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against me, and with it, a quiet sigh that seemed to let go of something she'd been holding for too long. I wrapped my arms around her, not tightly, but securely, letting her know I wasn't going anywhere. In that silence, I understood, it had started with one small favor, something simple and forgettable. But what we'd built between us wasn't charity, wasn't obligation. It was trust. It was care. And somewhere along the way, it had become love, gentle, steady, and real. The kind of love that didn't need explaining, because we both already knew.